Great stuff. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. It's great to see so many people from all over the world for our next Research Square webinar event, Writing for Research, Organizing and Focusing for Clarity. It's fantastic to be joined by one of our expert editors, Nancy Vesta. Nancy, how are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here to share some ideas for organizing and focusing for clarity in research. Our goals today are to make reading easier for reviewers and to make writing easier for you. So as Gareth said, I've been with AJE for approximately 4 years. I edit primarily in cell biology. My research was in the interaction between the epidermal growth factor receptor and the ganglioside GM3 at the plasma membrane. So primary signal transduction. And I'm here to help make your research communications faster, fairer, and more usable. So although I've only been at AJE for 4 years, I've spent 25 years editing. Some of the editing that I've done is in civil engineering, operational research, but most of my time I spent in higher education. And in one of my most interesting jobs, I actually worked as a desk editor. So authors would send in their manuscripts. I'd organize the reviewers, send the manuscript out for review, and then look at all the reviews, send it to the editor. The editor sent the comments back to me, and then I would send it back to the authors. So in essence, I saw things and learned things. And of all those papers that I've read over the years, this reviewer hit it on the head better than any I'd ever seen. They said, I feel like I'm in a museum at night. There's great stuff in here, but I can't see what it is. And likely the author just didn't stay focused or organize the ideas or clarify the language. And, you know, I've learned a few things about reviewers. Most of them really want to do a good job. You know, they really want to help authors. I mean, you always get a few jerks, right? But for the most part, they really want to improve the journal that they're working for, and they want to help authors along. So, but because they are busy themselves, because they are advanced in their careers and are doing lots of different things, they don't have a lot of extra time. And the papers that they're reading are interesting to them because it's in their field, but you know, they're not necessarily needing those papers to advance their own research. So they need to get through these papers quickly. And if they're struggling with your ideas and not able to connect the dots, the odds of you getting a glowing review are less likely. And we want to try to get you a glowing review, right? So in that same position, I worked with a lot of new time authors. Many of these authors had gotten a graduate degree, but they were in a practicum program, so they hadn't even written a thesis. And they had research ideas that they wanted to present. And so I spent a lot of time coaching them. And they had a very similar feeling about being in a museum at night. They would be like, you know, I can't get through all the stuff to find my way out of this process. And so, but from that point on, I realized, you know, it isn't that the ideas are bad. It isn't that the premises of these research papers are bad, but sometimes they're just not organized in a way to make that information accessible. And a lot of times writers will say, well, you know, I was told it's like a story. You know, that readers read your research papers like a story. And well, that's absolutely true, but you don't write a story the same way you read a story, right? No great author sat down and penned Once Upon a Time and then everything else came out perfectly, right? So both fiction writers and research writers should focus their ideas in a single statement that they can go back to over and over again to keep their ideas focused. And that is called a thesis statement. The thesis statement will be the objective in your abstract, the last sentence in your introduction, and the first sentence in your discussion. And bits and pieces of it will be used throughout. Primarily, the sentence, the thesis statement is going to answer the key questions. Why are you doing this? How did you do it? And what did you find? And it sounds a lot simpler than it is because you've been working on this stuff for years, right? And you were interested in a research question. And it's taken a lot of iterations to get to the point that you've written your paper. So you have to clarify what was the main purpose. And we're going to use an example from biology. We're going to talk about a need for a new breast cancer treatment. That's a really overarching goal, and most people aren't going to find the magic cure, obviously, in their research. But that was the driving the driving premise to run the research. You also had read about how certain compounds seem to be able to reduce tumor size and slow down cell proliferation. And a lot of people are interested in natural products now. So you thought, okay, let's take a look at this plant compound. Let's extract it and let's treat these cells. So your design was, you took compound X extracted from plant Z and applied it to breast cancer cell models and mouse models of breast cancer, and you measured the effects. And you found, miraculously, that indeed this compound did indeed work. Now, this doesn't talk about the concentrations you used. It doesn't talk about, how you actually ran the experiments. It's simply a guide to explain what you did, why you did it, and how you did it. The thesis statement would read something like, to find a new treatment for breast cancer, compound X extracted from plant Z was used to treat breast cancer cells and mouse models of breast cancer and was found to reduce cell proliferation and tumor size. It's a lot, right? But it has everything you need to organize your thoughts. And if you take out some infinitives, which are the verbs that start with to, like to find, to reduce, and you took out some prepositions, you have compound X from plant Z applied to breast cancer models, reduce cell proliferation and tumor size, and is a potential breast cancer treatment, which sounds an awful lot like a pretty decent title to me. So you can see where we're going with this. I want to try one more example to get the point across. We're going to do a higher education one. In this case, the researchers would have been looking at why certain students are dropping out of a class and trying to identify what the problem is. So the thesis statement would be to determine why second-year students drop out of Geology 101 at higher rates than first-year students. Class satisfaction was measured through a self-reported questionnaire, and lower satisfaction with the class was correlated with an increased dropout rate. So what was the problem? Students were dropping out of this class, and they noticed that it was second-year students. So they measured this by using a self-reported questionnaire to ask about student satisfaction. How and what? And what did they find? They found indeed that students who dropped the class had been less satisfied. Kind of common sense there, but it does help us illustrate the point. So you need to write a story based on the why, the how, and the what, and you need to start with the plot. The plot is basically your results, but it's best to systemize this process by looking at the methods at the same time. So it's a great place to start because, again, it is the crux of the paper. It's also what you spent the most time on. And if you can control this, if you can get this language under control and get this organization set up, the rest of the paper follows a lot easier. So it's kind of good. It's the stuff you know the best, and it's the stuff that needs to be organized the best. You can start with the methods or you can start with the results, but I would recommend you start with the results in making just an outline and then go to the methods and then go back to the results. So if you have an outline, you want to put your key result first, your secondary result second, and your novel results third. That gets tricky because sometimes like in the case of our biology example, we have both a cell model and an in vivo model, a mouse model. And the mouse model probably answers the question a little closer, but because you had to run the cell model first, you would certainly run cell tests before you ran mouse tests. You would put the cell biology results first. So you can kind of judge whether the key results are, you can divide by order of operation or by whether it's preliminary or primary. The idea is that the main thing is the first thing and the second thing, and that the supporting results go in between that and the novel results. That was kind of a long-winded way of saying, put the most important thing first and the least important thing last. I would make subheading titles so that you do have something to follow. And then I'd go back to the methods, because we want to make the methods reproducible. That's the key for that section in a paper, that another researcher can reproduce the results. But you need to make sure that every result has a method. And so by doing the parallel construction, you can be looking at your outline and making sure that every method that you include goes to that result, and that you're not including a lot of details on things that were truly preliminary. I mean, it's kind of sad. You probably spent, you know, a year of your life doing protein assays, but that's going to come down to a sentence in your methods. But by recognizing that the primary, what the primary result is, it's easier to keep your methods focused and in order. So we want to make sure that we put details in on the model, that the data analysis and the statistical analyses are clear. Just like in the, well, we haven't talked about the introduction, but we're going to move from general to specifics as we talk about each particular method. So again, we're going to describe the experiments in the order that they are reported in the results. The most important result, the most important experiments, and we're going to describe each experiment by the method that we used. So what does that look like? So you're going to have, you're going to talk about your cell cultures, then you're going to talk about your cell treatment, then you're going to talk about how you analyzed the results, Western blot or flow cytometry or whatever. General, you know, we bought the cells from, you know, ATCC, and we use them we use this treatment on them, and then we analyze the results by looking at some immunofluorescence, let's say. So we've structured each experiment with each result, and now we're going to talk about the most important things that often get missed in the methods section. Experiments are the easiest thing to write because you did them, right? But sometimes it's easy to forget that you have to justify why you picked the models you used and the variables you used. So you can't assume that the reader knows why you picked nude mice or why you picked a certain cell line and not primary cells, for example. So you need to make sure that your models are carefully described, and same thing with your variables. You need to make sure that that you clearly delineate what's the independent variable, what's the dependent variable, and they need to be named in a concise and consistent manner. You want to make sure that you're using the same terms throughout the paper, and that those terms are short and based on a noun. So, for example, one time I had a paper that I had to edit, and the authors had used full sentences for the names of their variables, and they were comparing the variables. The sentences were like 60 words long. It was awful, and that's a really extreme example, but it's easy to want to put too much information into the variable names. If you define them well enough in the methods, you can condense it into a reasonable and reproducible form. So I'll give you an example. Retain 2-year students doesn't have a verb in it. It's only 3 words because hyphens make it 2-year 1 word. And choosing to stay sophomore group means the same thing, but it's a lot more convoluted and has a verb in it. So in this example, I would choose retained 2-year students and using that throughout as my group name. Sometimes when you have multiple authors, that can be a problem, keeping it consistent. So you want to make sure that everybody on your team is using the same, or the lead author is making sure that the same name is used throughout the paper. When we talk about experiments and having to give a lot of details, well, obviously that could take, you could write a whole book on, in fact, they're called lab books, right? You need to write enough information that the reviewer or the casual reader can follow it. But you also need to provide information for those people who want to reproduce the experiment. So a lot of authors will use the trick of, we performed this experiment based on a previous publication or based on the manufacturer's instructions. And it's important, if you do that, to provide a summary. So we followed the manufacturer's instructions. In summary, we added reagent X and stopped the reaction with agent Y, and we measured it by optical density, let's say. So you provide enough information to prove to your reviewer and to prove to your reader that you did the experiment. But if someone wants to actually repeat that experiment, they can go back to the source and see all the gory details. Another thing that tends to be missing is methods of reporting. It's important that you explain in your methods how you're going to indicate significance. Is it a p-value, a confidence interval, whatever it is? You need to include that in your methods and not just have it show up in your results section. So there are some absolutely key things that certain journals will not even process your manuscript if you don't have. Not all of them, but some of them will ask for it. But if you don't make the mistake of leaving these out, and you don't have to worry about it, right? So if you're doing animal experiments, journals do not want to hear from an upset public that animals might have been misused in an experiment. So it's critical that you explain that you followed approved guidelines, that if you ran your experiments past the proper ethics board, which is often an institutional review board, and that you treated the animals humanely. And so I would go to the journal guidelines, it's usually under author notes, and make sure that you have what you need, preferably before you start your experiments, but certainly as you're writing your paper, you need to make sure that's in there. The other thing is informed consent. If you have human subjects in your research, sometimes informed consent is not necessary, but if it's not, you need to explain why it's not. It's also a good time to talk about your selection of subjects. How you found them may speak to bias that you're going to discuss in the discussion section. So making sure that you not only talk about how you got their consent, but how you recruited them is an important aspect to include in your methods. And finally, statistical analysis needs to be included. You can include it with each experiment, but I would also recommend that you have a statistical analysis summary that talks about the computer programs you might have used and any other kinds of tests, particularly unusual tests that you might have run to determine significance, and then definitely outline the significance thresholds that you used. Most cell biology papers do have this, but if your journal doesn't require it, just make sure that those analyses and significant thresholds are placed in the description of each experiment. So when we talk about how we write methods and results, one of the easiest things about these two sections in your paper are you can do it all in past tense. Very seldom would you need to use first person or present tense, I mean. So one of the easiest ways to write a results section and a method section is to use past tense. And that is actually the best tense to use. Because you did everything in the past, you don't have to generally use present tense. So you would use results showed, we found, groups performed. Similarly, you use first and third person, we found, we showed, or third person, the results indicated, the results suggested. The imperative, which would be like a recipe, like add reagent Y, incubate for 20 minutes, then add reagent X. That would be appropriate if you're using like an algorithm. Those are often set apart, sometimes even in separate tables. You wouldn't change how you would describe an algorithm. And they generally start with, do this, do that, step 1, step 2, that kind of thing. But for another kind of research paper, you want to stick with first and third person and complete sentences. And that even means when you have lists of things like antibodies, or you have lists of chemicals that you purchased, you still want to have an introductory phrase like the following antibodies were used in this study, or the following chemicals were purchased from, Thermo Scientific or whatever. So I have seen it where people will literally take the instructions off the bottle of the reagent and, use this amount, heat to 45 degrees, incubate for, you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you've changed those instructions into full sentences, not as commands. So as we look at how these things are in parallel. I'm not going to read all this because it would take too long, but I want to point out that in our methods section on the right side, we have our purpose, our models, our groups, our treatments, our quantitative analysis that showed our significant differences, and they're color coded. As we look at the results, we see where those things might show up. The treatment, and that comes in as we talk about the experiments we ran in the results. For example, in gray, we performed a Western blot analysis. You describe that in the methods, it's going to show up in the results of a Western blot analysis was performed. Okay, and you're going to talk about the model you used. We switched from breast cancer to lung cancer here, but it's A549 cells were used, and that was described clearly in your methods. Importantly, and often forgotten, you talk about how you compared your results to those of the control group, and your control group was clearly defined in the methods. And you noted your significance levels in your methods, so you can talk about significance in your results, which are in red. So if you were to look at your paper and color code everything, you shouldn't have one color only in either the methods or the results. So that's kind of how it looks when it's all put together correctly. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about writing results because, again, you spend a lot of time on your research, and it's easy to maybe for things to get out of focus. We want to keep it simple because you've already set up everything in your methods section. So the key here is do not include results for which there are no methods. And even when you're writing, you might consider using similar headings in both sections. I think I mentioned that. Don't use identical headings, though, in your final paper, because that gets very confusing as you're trying to move around a paper. But they can be very similar if that's the organization that if you choose to use those kinds of headings in your methods section, you want to make sure they're not the same. As you're writing the paper, you can keep them the same so that you can keep your thoughts straight. And you can keep your co-author straight. Again, sometimes the issue is not that any single author has forgotten something, but in the process of editing or combining the different paragraphs, things get lost. In very simple terms, each paragraph should have a topic sentence and a summary statement. We performed this experiment, and in the end, in summary, this experiment showed. And it's going to sound repetitious if that's what you do through your whole results, but it's better to be clear and boring than exciting and unclear. Talked about getting unfocused. Mission creep is a military term. It's used when a group of soldiers go out to capture, let's say, a bridge. They have an objective. And along the way, they realize that they can't capture the bridge without closing the road. And then they realize if they close the road, that the material can't get in from other sources. So they have to make an alternative route so that they can be supplied. And all of a sudden, they're doing all these other things and they forgot to secure the bridge. Or it becomes a secondary fact and maybe they don't even have enough soldiers now to do that mission. So mission creep is when you start talking more about the side things than about the main things. And this is why it's important to have this thesis statement, because for every result, it should relate back to your key premise, your key question, your key gap in research you're trying to fill. So if you start spending, 2 or 3 sentences on routine protein assays and what they showed, then perhaps you're not focusing on the main thing to the extent that maybe you could. So it's a way to refine what you're talking about and making sure that you stay on track with those main results. And of course, you talk about your preliminary results, your protein assays. You talk about those things, in the methods, and you might mention them in the results, but you don't want to make them the focal point of your paper. I see this sometimes when their premise was to see if proteins interact, and then when they find they interact, they want to go into finding, what sites on the 2 proteins are actually interacting. And they go through a lot of experiments to do that with like molecular modeling. But the premise of the paper was, do they interact, and what is the result of their interaction? And a lot of the paper spent on the mechanism, but that wasn't the focus of the paper. So you want to include the mechanism, of course, and that might actually be something to build off in your novel results to talk about the next step in the research. But if the premise was, we want to find out what happens when these two proteins interact, that might not be the best focus. You might spend too much time in your research results talking about that aspect of research. When we talk about writing results, we often talk about comparisons. There are like a gazillion ways to write a comparison. And so, but they're also really difficult to write. So I've suggested a few ways that you can write results that might be clear, because they're kind of formulaic. And again, we're not after excitement, we're after clarity. So if you have a couple that are written the exact same way, but they're clear, that's okay. In one strategy, you can keep compared groups together and use the term compared to. Compared to first-year students, second-year students reported greater satisfaction with the class. And notice I added the p-value there. In this case, you have the two groups together, and then you write the rest of the sentence. You can also separate groups with a superlative and then. So in the next case, we're going to have the first-year students reported lower satisfaction with the class than second-year students, and you'll see that the two groups are at the two ends of the sentences, and that the superlative, the term lower, superlative simply means you have ER or EST at the end of the word, lower, higher, better, best, that kind of thing. That's in the middle. When you have more complicated comparisons, you might have to go with a parallel example. And these are harder to write, but it's important that they are written in parallel. So you can start with keeping groups and variables in parallel using compared to. You're going to start the sentence with compared to, that reported by first-year students, class satisfaction reported by second-year students was high. In this case, I replaced class satisfaction with that in the dependent clause, because the class satisfaction has to be in the main clause, because that's the noun, that's the subject noun of the sentence. So you can use that, so you don't have to repeat class satisfaction, but you could say compared to the class satisfaction reported by first-year students, class satisfaction reported by second-year students was high. The other option is to use the superlative and then. So self-reports indicated that satisfaction with the class was lower in first-year students than in second-year students. And you'll notice the two compared groups came before the comparison of, that the two groups were at the end of the sentence, with the comparison, the lower than, the superlative coming before. So these are some suggestions that you can follow. The bottom line is, if you're doing a parallel example, each word in what you're comparing has to be similar to the word that you're using for the compared group. And sometimes just looking at examples are easier than trying to explain it. Similarly, we want to talk about using the word similar or in contrast. We don't use like or unlike in scientific papers because it's a little too informal. But so that's one of the points I want to make here. But the other point is you can use similar in a way to change the emphasis. In these two examples, the sentences say the exact same thing. Increased temperature caused a change in topography that was similar to the effect caused by increased water pressure, or the effect of increased temperature and topography was similar to that caused by increased water pressure. In the first example, I would expect that the paragraph before it, the sentences before it, talked about temperature and its effect on things. In the second, I would expect that the paragraph discussed the comparison between temperature and water pressure. So again, using similar to and in contrast can be used to really make a point, but do use similar to and in contrast, and you can use them effectively to keep the focus the same throughout a paragraph. And finally, as we're digging deeper into our results, I do want to make a note about the word proved. I see this quite a bit, but as scientists, we don't really prove. We might make a theory, we might have such profound results that we can base further results on it. But whenever we come up with a result, it's often restricted by the time that it was found, meaning that it's restricted by the methods that were available to us. It was restricted by the information we already had. So I would highly recommend not using proved in your results. I would you can use showed, suggested, or indicated. But if a reviewer sees proved, they might feel like you're trying to overstate the results. So that's just a little tip for finishing up our results. And now we're going to move into our discussion, which in some ways is more difficult, but more fun. It's more difficult because you have to do the thinking for the reader. You have to guide them through the museum. But the discussion is fun because you get to show how your results are relevant. You can get excited again about all that you did by explaining why your results lead to better information in the field, or lead to a result that might even help treat a disease, or help make students more satisfied. So the whole point of a discussion is to make it relevant. And to do that, as we talked about, your thesis statement is going to set off your discussion. You're going to remind readers why you performed the study. And that's important also because your reviewer might jump from the introduction to the discussion to see if what you have to say is even worth going further into the paper. So you want to make sure that you discuss the relevance and your findings in a way that's easy to access. That's also true for other readers. Like if you're doing a preprint and it hasn't gone through the process, you want to make sure that your readers who are just looking to see if your paper might be interesting to them, if they jump to the discussion, they know what the paper was about, and they know what you found, and they know why it's relevant. So don't assume that they read the other parts of the paper. Restate your thesis, as we talked about, and include the important details. What I see somewhat frequently is that the information that's in the discussion should have been in the introduction. And the difference is, I think, because it's a little confusing, because in both cases you might be bringing in reference information from other authors. You might be talking about other studies, but in the introduction, you're using those other studies to set the stage for your research question. It's background information. In the discussion, we're talking about other studies that might support your findings or might refute your findings, and it gives you the opportunity to discuss how your results were supported, and or why your results better reflect the situation than maybe the results of someone who reports contradictory information. So to do that, to do this kind of comparison, you need to make sure that you've included information about the relevance and the novelty, and you also, in your discussion, want to talk about future directions. So, So when we talk about how to establish a discussion, we want to ask key questions. We want to talk about why you performed the study, what were the outcomes, and how did you determine that? Well, obviously, this is something we've done throughout the paper, right? We look at our thesis statement and we kind of reiterate the same thing. But in this case, the emphasis is going to be on how those results supported the hypothesis. It's also important that you discuss any limitations or resolutions. So, let's say you performed this class satisfaction study at a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, the United States. You would have to make a limitation statement saying that these results may not be generalizable to all universities, and therefore more research needs to be done at different types of universities or with different classes. But a limits section is pretty important in most papers because it helps establish that you do understand the relevance of the paper and what it does and doesn't say. So again, it makes a paper more complete and does help to refine how a reviewer might be looking at your relevant statements. You also want to include future directions, and of course you want to end with a summary. Unlike our results and our methods, we're going to have a mixed tense situation in our discussion. We bring together results which are in the past tense. Our thesis statement might even be in the present tense, and the implications might be in the future tense. So you will have to probably use both present tense, the result, the findings indicate. You might have to talk about what you did, we performed. You will talk about these results will be important for future research. But also important are connecting terms that bring paragraphs together. Again, we're past our plot of our paper and we're concluding things. So we want to remind readers as we make our main points. So we're going to use words like moreover, we showed, or remind readers of what we did by using introductory phrases like as shown. And that keeps your paragraphs connected and even your sentences connected, so it doesn't just look like an afterthought where you put this information in at the end. You're still conversational. In fact, the discussion section is probably the most conversational because you can really do the compare contrast with other papers and be a little bit less rigid in your language. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be less rigid. You can be less rigid in your thoughts. Finally, you want to use some power terms. You've got important things to say. You don't want to say, well, it seems that, maybe, sort of, kind of. We showed this. This may mean that. It has the potential to show. Be confident in what your results are. Be confident in what the importance of it is. So some examples we can use to discuss this issue of tense changing. I think I might have already said these, but in this study, we showed that increasing the pressure exerted a profound effect. Obviously, that would be in past tense. The method we used is the gold standard. It wasn't the gold standard in the past, it's the gold standard now. So you need to use is in the present tense. And our findings will lead to improved yields for large scale production. The connecting terms could be notably, highlighting an important finding. We also might talk about how, however, our results were limited by the lack of suitable antibodies, or in contrast, the PCR test showed no increase in mRNA levels. So there's some examples of how you can connect thoughts throughout the paper, but particularly in the discussion. And the power terms, these results clearly showed the mutant exerted a profound effect. We concluded that the artifact was effectively removed, and notably further research is needed to verify these results. Okay, so now we go back to the beginning. And I kind of mentioned this before, but just like the methods and the results are in parallel, the introduction and the discussion is written in parallel. You're going to have your aims, you're going to have the purpose for why you're going to explain why you did it. You're going to explain the methods you used, and you're going to talk about your findings and your implications. In both cases, you're answering the question, why are you doing this study? And you're going to summarize the background in the discussion, but you're going to expand the background in the introduction. In terms of your findings, you're going to allude to your findings. You're going to state them very simply in the introduction, but in the discussion, you're going to expand them. In the discussion specifically, we're going to relate each result to the question that was asked or the purpose of the paper. You're going to discuss how it was answered, and you're going to discuss how it mattered. In the introduction, you're pretty much going to explain your results and how they matter, but you're going to summarize it. Most introductions are only a few paragraphs long. So because they tend to be shorter. You need to include all and only the salient points, but you need to justify each point. This is the section in which you make the case. You organize from general to specific. Cancer is a bad disease. We wanted to find a treatment for cancer. Therefore, we tested these compounds. And then you have to support the reasons that you chose with context. So, for example, we know cancer is a bad disease because the WHO data show that these number of people have passed away from cancer, or we know this compound is a good one to test because previous researchers have shown that it works in a different disease. So again, you're using background information, you're bringing background studies in with proper references to justify why you chose the question that you're asking and the design that you used to answer it. Remember that deductive reasoning is easier than inductive reasoning. So you're going to lead them from bigger to smaller, not giving them bits and pieces and asking the reader to put them together to make a bigger statement. So when we say from general to specific, that's another way of saying use deductive reasoning. It's really critical to avoid the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is when you know something so well because you've been working on it for 1, 2, 5, 7 years, whatever the case may be. You might know your research better than you know your kids' names. Your reviewer doesn't. And it's very easy to write what you know without giving the proper context. So one thing to remember is that reviewers are experts in their own fields, but they're not reviewers in all fields. And so you need to make sure that every author on your paper also understands that they have to explain why they did something, because it may not be as obvious to the reader and particularly the reviewer as it is to you. So a guideline you can use for your introduction in particular is, can a layperson understand what you did? Or a first-year graduate student, if it's a little bit more technical, can they understand what your premise was, what your question was that you were trying to answer, and how it relates to the larger field? And so if in doubt, put it in, because it's a lot easier to take things out than to put things in. So again, you're going to state the problem of your paper, explain the reason your research question was asked, provide the background, justify the methods, summarize the results, explain the relevance, and you're going to end with your thesis statement that's going to draw the reader into your methods or results, depending on which comes next. Similar to the discussion, the introduction will have mixed tense probably, because you're going to talk about past results and what you did and what the current situation is. The connections are similar, but they might be more important even than in the discussion, because the danger is, and I see this quite a bit, an introduction will look like kind of a laundry list of what we did and what we found. And even if the adequate explanation for why you chose the design or why you chose the research question is there, it's disjointed. So probably the connecting words, and we'll give some examples, are probably even more important here than in the discussion, but they're really important in both. I want to make a statement about references. You need to make sure that your references are complete and that they follow the guidelines that the journal uses, and that's usually in the author notes. So for examples, for tense, the mortality rate for disease X is increasing. Previous studies showed that compound X was an effective treatment, past tense. In this study, we found that compound X was an inexpensive treatment, again, past tense. The connecting terms that we use here can actually help guide the reader from general to specific. In general, self-reports of satisfactions are accurate. Not sure that's even true, but for the point of illustration, that works. Therefore, questionnaires are typically used to determine study satisfaction. Okay, so we stated it, made the statement in general, then we supported our reasoning for using the design by saying therefore, and then we're going to give more reasons why this was a good way to study this problem. Moreover, or in addition, students can conveniently complete the forms in class. So again, our references need to be complete, and you can look for the author notes on the journal website to determine what style those references need to be in. Getting to the end here, I want to wrap up with a few more things on the introduction. All abbreviations in a paper need to be defined. Typically, we expect terms to be abbreviated. Typically, we expect that all abbreviations in a paper be defined both in the abstract and in the introduction, or in the first place it appears in the paper. And in many cases, most of them are going to be in the introduction, or a lot of them are going to be in the introduction. So you need to decide what kind of abbreviation pattern you want to follow. You can either write out the word and give the abbreviation, like epidermal growth factor receptor, and in parentheses EGFR, or write the abbreviation EGFR and then write the word that defines that abbreviation. And I think almost always people write the word and then the abbreviation, because then you can write your paper and go back in and add the abbreviations later. It makes the paper less cumbersome by using this form, I think. But either is acceptable as long as you're consistent throughout. Finally, I want to talk about the words never and always. When you're trying to make the case, it's easy to overstate what the question is that needs to be answered, or what the problem is. I would not use never and always, because in science that's just seldom true. I would use typically, frequently, or almost always, or almost never, as we're trying to clarify, trying to emphasize our results and stay away from always and ever. Okay, so now we're down to the last thing you do, or the first thing you do, but the last thing you revise. One of the most troubling things I see in papers is sometimes the abstract was clearly written before the paper, and it might have even been like lifted from a grant proposal or something like that, because it's close, but it doesn't exactly match the paper. Like the premise is a little off, or the design is usually the same, the methods are usually the same, but there's something about it. Even the words that were used in the abstract don't match the words that are used in the paper. So if you used an abstract to get funding for your paper, be sure that you revise it based on the little deviations that the actual research took, so that the terms are the same. In general, you've heard a lot about abstracts, I'm sure. They're the perfect summary. It is also important to note, though, that sometimes the reviewer only gets to the abstract, or I should say the editor. The editor might read the abstract, and if it's not clear, or it doesn't appear that the research is suitable for the journal, or it doesn't appear that the results contribute a great deal to the field, they might not even send the paper out to review. So you really must be very careful in putting together your abstract, because it might be the first step of your review, or it might be the only step of your review. An abstract stands alone. Therefore, it has to be clear, it has to be concise. And as we talked about initially, you want to keep the messaging the same. When you're looking at the words you're using for the purpose and the conclusion, make sure that those same words are used in the introduction and the discussion. Because again, even if you are describing the same thing, if they're a little off compared to how the final paper came together, it might look like the abstract doesn't quite fit the paper. So some journals have especially in cell biology, they have very structured abstracts, and those are very helpful because you just basically fill in the blank. But even if you don't, you can still use this very organized method of giving the objective, providing enough background that you can understand why the methods were used, to summarize the results, and to importantly give a clear and profound conclusion. we also have keywords that will be added at the end of the abstract. So the objective is basically the thesis statement, the premise for your study. The background and the methods explain the rationale for why you picked the topic and why you chose certain methods to answer the question, and the results support the objective. Again, it's difficult to provide sufficient background in an abstract, and sometimes it actually gets left out, and that's not good. You need to find at least a sentence on why to position your question, your research in the current field, or to fill a gap in the field, or to basically to get an answer that you're looking for. You need to provide at least a little bit of background of why it's important and why that question was asked. I just want to say a word about keywords. If the keywords don't fit aren't in the abstract, then they're not keywords. So all your keywords, whether some, different journals have different numbers, make sure those keywords are used in some way in your journal. This often has to do also with how your article may be searched. That's kind of beyond the scope of this discussion, but do spend some time on keywords. Make them specific enough that someone searching for a paper on this topic will find your paper. Putting out breast cancer is going to lead to a lot of different papers. So the biggest problem that a lot of authors run into after they've articulated those key steps in their abstract is making it fit the word count that the journal wants. And this is really hard. And I'm going to give you a few tips that might help. But it is important that you turn the abstract in the proper word count. If it doesn't meet the word count, they may not pass it on. So as we talked about before, you can eliminate unnecessary prepositions. Oftentimes we can say, we can use an adjective noun combination instead of a prepositional phrase. And infinitives are verbs that are two words: to run, to walk, to hide. And you can often turn those into one words using like an ing participle kind of phrase. So we'll give some examples in a minute, but look at your verbs and look at your prepositions, the connecting phrases, and see if you can't condense them. The other thing is, depending on if the journal allows it, you can either go with no abbreviations or all abbreviations. So, if you need to talk about, liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, you don't want to necessarily have to write that all out. You may be able to say LC, MC, MS, and that would indicate that you did, liquid chromatography and tandem mass spectrometry. Easy for me to say. So that's one option, and you can see in the author notes if that would be allowed, and that can reduce having to repeat lengthy terms by using abbreviations or not defining abbreviations in the abstract. So another trick, and this is kind of cheating, but you can turn two words into one by using a hyphen. And I didn't give an example of that, but if you really get desperate, that's something you can think about. So going back to our initial statement, our initial thesis statement, I talked about how I took out infinitives and prepositions. And so here's just an example. I highlighted the infinitives, I highlighted the prepositions, and I showed you how I edited the paper. I edited the sentence, and how that edit reduced the word count from 37 words to 22 words. So that is one way to look at reducing your word count. Of course, obviously, you can look at making lists of methods instead of describing them in detail, but it takes a lot of work, and I would certainly start before having to cut out information. I would start with cutting out verbiage. We covered a lot in an hour, and there's some big nuggets I hope you'll take away. I hope that there were specific things that might be helpful to you, but in general, you need to justify every decision you make. Don't assume that people understand why you chose the models or the variables. make sure that you can, just like you're doing an oral thesis, right? Or your oral defense for your thesis, make sure that you can defend every choice that you made. Don't assume that the readers understand what you made, that the readers know that, even if they're reading in a specialized journal. You might be, readers from other disciplines might be reading it and not understand what you're getting at. And more importantly, you might have a reviewer that's reviewing your paper because they're the experts on statistics, might not know much about your actual research. You need to make it accessible to them. Think in parallels. Every section reinforces the other one. And finally, and most importantly, make the research, the thesis statement, your guide. Stick it on your computer, stick it in your car, stick it anywhere you're thinking about your research, because as you're asking questions and developing ideas, you want to make sure that what you're including is in that thesis statement. So I thank you very much for joining me today. It was fun sharing some of these observations with you. I'm going to throw it back to Gareth and let him close us out. Thank you.
Nancy, that was absolutely great. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for presenting today for us. And I've seen that there are hundreds of questions coming in the chat box. We've been posting responses to those questions as colleagues have been putting them into the chat box. And we're going to leave the room open, and we're going to provide lots of feedback and lots of opportunities for you to ask questions over the next few minutes.